Well, welcome again, everyone. My name is Cristine Nardi. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Nonprofit Excellence, and we're really excited to be talking with you today about this new Virginia Nonprofit Sector Report. Encourage everybody, if you haven't yet, to go ahead and introduce yourselves in the chat. We're looking forward to seeing who's with us today. CNE is a champion, a learning partner, and an advisor to Virginia nonprofits. And in this role, we develop and convene around actionable data to strengthen the nonprofit sector. And I hope you all will be interested in the information that we have to share with you today, and really encourage you to ask questions along the way. So I want to introduce who's with me today. We have Joeffrey Trimmingham and Paitra Russell. They are principals of Philip Reese, our research partners for this report. Philip Reese is a qualitative research agency, and Joff and Paitra not only provided custom research and data analysis for this report, but also have been true collaborating partners. So we're thrilled to have them with us today. We also want to start with special thanks to two foundations who supported this project and helped provide some underwriting for the data that we collected in the report that we'll be talking about today. So special thanks to the PATH Foundation in Warrenton and the OBC Foundation in Suffolk, Virginia. And lastly, thanks to the CNE project lead for the report, Ian Coppage. This is our first comprehensive statewide sector report, but it builds on the work that we did in the height of the pandemic to keep a pulse on the social impact sector. This report includes a sector overview. It includes information on workforce and economic data related to the sector. It also includes information on capacity building needs of the nonprofit organizations that took the survey. And lastly, it includes recommendations that are actionable for nonprofits, funders, and government to think about how to use this data in furtherance of their own work. The survey and the report are framed by CNE's 7 actionable principles for a strong social sector. The 7 actionable principles combines local wisdom, national frameworks, and leading practices in support of a thriving sector. The framework is intended to strengthen nonprofits and relationships between nonprofits and funders, and offer a common language around key and proven practices that enable the social impact sector to thrive. You can learn more about the 7 actionable principles on page 6 of this report, as well as on the 7 actionable principles website, and we'll drop a link to the website in the chat. Now I'm excited to introduce Joff and Paitra from Philip Reese to join me to share survey highlights. You can see in our agenda that we'll be taking breaks along the way for questions. So we encourage you to put questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom, and we will take some breaks along the way to answer those questions and be in dialogue with you all around these survey results. And we'll tackle as many questions as we can during this hour of the town hall. So welcome, Joff and Paitra.
Thanks, Christine. I'm going to kick us off. I'm, again, Paitra Russell. I'm the principal researcher at Philip Reese. This presentation is an overview of the nonprofit sector. We'll be talking about some highlights from the report with an eye toward understanding equity within the sector. The study was undertaken really to provide data that builds both sector knowledge and connections that can lead to better community outcomes. So what we're sharing with you today is just the snapshot. There's a lot more detail in the study report. I think there's a link to it at the end, but we wanted to share some highlights, and that's what we'll be doing today. As Christine mentioned, we owe a debt of gratitude to the OBC Foundation, the PATH Foundation, and in addition, some leaders from 3 organizations that are focused on capacity building in the nonprofit sector, who acted as advisors to the project. So that's Cindy Colson of CNE, Veronica McMillan of the Micro Nonprofit Network of Virginia Beach, and Kim Herbstritt of the Blue Ridge Habitat for Humanity in Winchester. Their guidance and shaping of the study was really invaluable. So we are very appreciative of their help. And then we also, of course, want to thank the many survey respondents. We had 242 respondents to the survey. We also conducted follow-up interviews with 24 nonprofit leaders. Most of the data that you will be seeing comes from that. We also have some secondary sources. We are using the IRS to provide our sector data. We're using the US Census Bureau for population data. And the Frank Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy at UVA provided employment data. In addition to all of that, we really wanted to be be intentional about engaging the community. And so prior to even launching the survey, we did interviews with stakeholders and design sessions with capacity builders, all to make sure that there were a variety of voices that were included as we designed and executed the study. So those 242 survey respondents that I mentioned are operating in all regions of the Commonwealth. We used the Virginia Department of Education definition of regions. And so all 8 of these regions that you see on the map are represented in the survey, among the survey respondents. Their headquarters spanned 58 localities and counties. And many of those respondents serve multiple regions. So they were really able to talk kind of from the perspective, not only of where they're headquartered, but where they are also doing their work. All right, so one other thing we wanted to point out was that respondents were well distributed across budget sizes. We really wanted to be sure we had a variety of types of nonprofits included in this project. So about half of the respondents had annual budgets over 500,000, and about half had annual budgets that were under 500,000. So we chose that as the kind of break point between organization sizes. So you'll see, throughout our comments that we're talking about larger organizations versus smaller organizations, and that's what we mean by that. Larger is referring to those that are above 500, and smaller is referring to those that are under in those instances. All right, I think I'm going to hand it over to Joeffrey now, and he's going to talk to us about the state of the sector.
All right, thank you, Paitra. So there is a lot of information in the final report, and we hope you'll take some time to go through it. But today we wanted to touch on some highlights that seem particularly relevant, starting with a look at the sector as a whole. So based on April 2022 IRS master file data, there are approximately 35,000 501c nonprofit organizations in Virginia, with 26,732 of those organizations designated as 501c3. This slide represents a breakdown of how those nonprofits are distributed by service area. And you'll see that the largest grouping is human services with 6,907. We'll come back to that number in just a little bit because there was something that's somewhat surprising, but also, a point of interest that we will talk about in a bit. So nonprofits employ about a quarter of the public service workers in the state, whereas nationally, that's around 1/3. We're not sure what the discrepancy is there, that number, but we thought it was an interesting factoid that there are fewer, there's a statistically lower percentage within the nonprofit sector here versus other parts of the country. They employ just under 276,000 people, which represents roughly 6% of all employed persons in the state. A key point that we saw here was that nonprofit employment has not kept pace with the employment with the state overall. So there's a reference point from 2016 that we have been using throughout this study. And at this time, we know statistically that there are now 2,000 fewer people working in the nonprofit sector, while statewide employment has increased by 180,000, and that's between 2016 and 2022. Again, not sure what the reason is for that, but we've heard lots from organizations about challenges with staffing, and that organizations are essentially competing with the broader economy for staff. A look at the financial picture. Virginia 501c3 organizations reported $86.9 billion in revenue, $48.3 billion in expenses. 146.9 billion in assets, and 13.5 billion in contributions. Those that revenue is not really distributed equally, obviously. For instance, within the number of nonprofits focused on human services was just under 7,000, and roughly 4 times the number of those focused in health. The revenue in the health-focused organizations is over 5 times that of human services agencies. And there are other discrepancies that we saw here that are worthy of a deeper dive by those who want to really dig into those numbers and try to understand what's happening. So we're going to pause there, and I'll turn it back to Cristine to lead some Q&A if there are any questions in the chat. Oh,
Thanks, Tom.
sorry. One more slide. Sorry. This one's important. Not surprisingly, there was a significant revenue disparities by region also. Some of this may be due to centers of influence, such as in Northern Virginia. There are a large number of national and global nonprofits, or in Central Virginia and the sort of Central West part of it, there are large academic institutions. But the divergence between population percentage and revenue percentage in the Northern Neck and Middle Peninsula, as well as Southwest and South Side, indicate that those areas may be significantly under-resourced in comparison to their population. So on the slide, you'll see in Region 3, Region 7, and 8 that the regional revenue is in Region 3 about half that of the population percentage. In Region 8, it's about 1/3, and in Region 7, it's about 1/5. So Cristine, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Joeffrey. And before we move forward, I also want to say a special thank you to Evelyn Riley from the Dan River Nonprofit Network, who also was an advisor to us in this study. So Evelyn, I think you're out there in the audience, and thanks as well to you. 2 questions that have come up. One is, Joeffrey, could you speak to the ways in which you engage the community in the design, development, and direction of the study?
Yeah, so we were very intentional beginning with trying to understand what the capacity building sector was really interested in. So we convened that group that Paitra mentioned earlier to help get a sense of what the needs were in various parts of the states, what the perceptions were. And then we went to the funder community to try to understand what they were looking for from this sort of study. So as Paitra mentioned, we interviewed, I believe, roughly 11 funders from various parts of the state to try to get their perspectives on the way into designing the study. And then as we were fielding it, we used both the networks of CNE and the partners that we were working with, and as well as those foundations, to distribute the survey as broadly as we could, to try to get inputs from those various parts of the state. And as you saw from the slide that Paitra presented, we got pretty good representation from throughout the state. We believe that there are opportunities for improving that, especially in Southwest and northern parts of the state. But I hope that answers your question. If you have any further questions, happy to answer them.
Thanks. And then a couple of folks with curiosity around the numbers that you shared between the health and human services disparate numbers. And the question is really around, does the health part of that wheel represent hospitals, nonprofit hospitals?
It does, in our thinking, it does include that. So again, I think there's opportunities to really parse through that data to understand what is happening, because obviously healthcare is much higher in terms of cost on a general basis. But we know also that a larger percent of the population is participating in healthcare and the healthcare system versus with nonprofits. So there are lots of things that can be taken apart there.
Great, thanks. I think that catches us up on the questions. So I think we're ready to move on to the next section.
Okay, thank you. So I'll start the next section and then I'll kick it over to Paitra. So we wanted to spend a little bit of time looking at some key findings. And the first one we want to check in on is workforce development. Here we see that securing and retaining skilled staff is a major challenge for the sector. As I mentioned earlier, nonprofits are competing with other parts of the economy, with remote work, with the cost of living, and challenges with workforce development. One of the ways that this shows up is in terms of leadership development, where there is strong need for support. We had 78% reporting urgent need for growing leaders across their organizations. And with larger organizations, they said that leadership and management training would have enabled them to boost their impact. So really critical that there appears to be significant need in gaining resources that can help these organizations to develop their leaders and to support them through training and other activities related to that. In addition, there are general personnel challenges. So the pandemic, as we know, had many impacts, but volunteer and staff availability stood out in our data. Most often, the COVID-19 impacts that were shown lowered the availability of volunteers and staff. They reported that 33% reported challenges with limited or no availability among volunteers during the pandemic due to disruptions with child and dependent care issues. And this number for staff was 23%. We believe that this has recovered a bit, but what we heard through the research constantly was that staff and issues related to staff continued to be a large challenge. So several things that were said. I really think the staffing thing is bigger than we know. We need great staff. We need people to invest in us so we can invest in great staff. We need messaging around that, education for funders and nonprofits on the need to invest in self. Another respondent said, reducing the workload is most important because the volunteers and workforce have evaporated. We have burnout and too heavy workload simply because there are fewer people. And then a third added, burnout and trauma, which are really strong statements, are the biggest challenges for the nonprofit sector. The Great Resignation will snowball as boomers retire. Can capacity builders provide training for frontline staff and leadership development? So and this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what people were saying. There's a lot there, and we think this may be the most significant issue among organizations and linked to funding, obviously. So what can we do? There are a number of specific recommendations in the report, but the sector and the supporters need to work on building sector capacity and attracting, training, and retaining committed staff and leaders. One of the things that is provided in the report is there are a number of recommendations or action areas where nonprofits, funders, and government can work. And so we picked out one of those to share with you here, and we'll do that in each of the other sections. So an action for funders is to fund proposals and projects for development of staff, leadership, and boards, understanding that strong leaders seed impactful programs. So really that we heard over and over again that there are lots of resources available for operations, for program execution, but not for staff development and other behind the scenes or infrastructure sorts of functions in organizations. So with that, I will turn it over to Paitra to go through the next section.
Thanks, Joeffrey. So I'm going to be talking about another key area of insight, which was around capacity building. All nonprofits need accessible capacity building support. Not really a surprise, right? But the types of support they need can differ widely. So, we think the differences in the needs are important. So that's really what I'm going to focus on in the next couple of slides. In terms of what capacity building support looks like, almost all nonprofits across the board, regardless of their size, said they need help identifying specific funders and developing intentional mission-inspired relationships. And by intentional mission-inspired relationships, what we mean is relationships with funders who kind of understand and have an expressed appreciation for that organization's mission, as opposed to sort of being solely program focused. So, we saw that across the board for both small and large, but you'll see on the next slide that there were other areas where nonprofits were expressing a need for support. So clearly growing our funding support was a need for just about everyone. But they're also talking about a need for support in skills training and role clarity for board members, improving the financial position, leadership training for both senior staff and junior staff. And what we see here again is larger organizations and smaller organizations having slightly different priorities. Larger organizations, you'll see at the very bottom there, about half of them, 49%, said that leadership management and training for junior and mid-level staff was a key area where they needed support in terms of capacity building. For smaller organizations, the key area really was in skills training and role clarity for board members. So, just an illustration that a need for capacity building support is there, but it does differ depending on, the size of it can differ depending on the size of your organization. A couple of the things that we heard people say, about capacity building, really, they kind of sum up the bottom line. What's most important is for grant funders to acknowledge operating costs, right? And that's true for both small and large organizations. But then with the smaller organizations, they also say they're looking for help navigating that funding ecosystem. We need help with growing funding support and budgeting. What are we looking toward? Are we going on the right path? Are other organizations doing this? How do I put grant writing together? So, smaller organizations really talking about some of the very fundamental skills support that they need versus larger organizations talking a little bit at a higher level in terms of workforce development. Again, what can we do given this situation? We think that a key action is to provide unrestricted core support so that nonprofits can fully fund operations that sustain programs and that facilitate access to individualized capacity building support. We also think it's important for funders to build and sustain targeted awareness about the resources that are actually available to nonprofits so that they can find and utilize them. There was a lot of lack of awareness that we heard about during the study. In terms of the actions that you'll see in the report itself, we pulled an example action for nonprofits for this capacity building area. And it's really about building budgets that are inclusive of each key function of the organization. And making sure those budgets also include projections for both the programs and for the operations that are required to maintain organizational health. I think Joeffrey is going to talk to us about diversity, equity, and inclusion. You're on mute. Joeffrey, you're on mute.
Thank you, Paitra. Sorry about that. So within this key finding area, diversity, equity, and inclusion, senior leadership tends to be white and female, while leaders of other organizational positions are more diverse. This may not be surprising to most of you, but there's some things in here that we thought are interesting. So in terms of DEI commitment and support, while 30% said that their organization has a long-standing commitment to DEI, nearly 3/4 expressed a need for support in their efforts. So a key point here was that we think the stats suggest that there is a sense of a commitment and momentum around DEI, but nonprofits are wanting to do more and need the resources to be able to do more. Our study sample is more diverse than the national statistics suggest, and I'll touch on that in a moment. But even with this, we saw that leadership, race, and ethnic identity varies from the state population. At the outset of the study, we set a goal to hear from a range of sector organizations led by a variety of people. In our results, board chair and lead executive roles, and by that we mean executive directors and CEOs, presidents, et cetera, among whites is higher than their percentage of the overall population at 70% and 67% respectively. National data, though, indicates that those percentages are more in the range of 83% and 87% respectively. So we saw a significant underrepresentation among Latino and Hispanic residents, who represent 10% of Virginia's population, but 2% of the board chairs and 1% of lead staff members within our study. Nationally, those numbers are 5% for each role. So there's a lot to sort of parse and disentangle here. Again, we strove to have a more diverse look at the state than might be there. And so we believe that we achieved that, and that's borne out in the numbers, but we can still see that there are some disparities here. In essence, there's still a lot of work to be done in improving leadership diversity. One of the things that we saw leading into the next slide is the slight majority of respondents, which was around 60%, say that their organization's demographics reflect their community from board to staff to volunteers. But they were also, we also saw that there were some differences in terms of how diversity is working within roles or across roles in those organizations. For instance, we saw a greater percentage of people in program lead positions who identify as African-American versus or Latino than in finance, operations, development, roads, or lead positions. Here, when we think about the pipeline for more diverse leaders, maybe the opportunity where as organizations are looking for diverse leadership, that pipeline might be within those program leaders and in that role. All right, so there are 3 areas with the highest DEI support needs. They were guidance in updating organizational strategy, fundraising practices, and programs to be more inclusive and produce more equitable outcomes at 66%, increasing organizational capacity or reducing the current workload to address issues of equity within our organization with 57%, and then meaningful facilitated conversations among board and staff to develop shared understanding of equity-related concepts with 55%. So what do we do here? The recommendation is to challenge organizations to examine leadership investments, selection, and succession so they can more closely mirror their communities. A government action that was recommended in the report is to establish a statewide initiative to incentivize students to work in the nonprofit sector that could include tuition reimbursement, for instance, in partnership with Virginia Community Colleges and HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities in the state. That's sort of a macro opportunity. There are micro opportunities that are mentioned in the report for consideration. So we'll take another break there and answer some questions.
Thanks to you both. So we've got a couple questions coming in. The first one I think is around the design and development of the survey instrument. So one of the participants asked for a little bit more information about the evidence generated for the instrument's reliability and validity.
So we did a couple of things. One is that much of the content or the concept for the survey instrument was drawn from national studies. So we looked broadly at other studies that were in the sector in this space to draw from that. We do not think that this is an instrument that we can say can be pushed out across the board to be used, because this is the first time we've done this. As we've said before, this is a snapshot of what we're seeing in the state, and we hope that we'll be able to work with partners to really understand where there are opportunities to improve on it over the next couple of years. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks. Go ahead, Paige.
I was just going to add that in terms of reliability and validity, we're not reporting statistics at, a certain level of confidence, but we did take pains to try to be sure that the qualitative aspects of the study meet standards of trustworthiness and reliability that we use when a study is more qualitative at its base. And so I would be happy to talk with people about, what that looks like, what kind of reliability and trustworthiness metrics we have for this study.
Thanks, Paitra. And I think related to that is a question around, of course, we did the survey, and then, as you mentioned, there were a lot of follow-up conversations with survey participants. And so a question around, what did you learn probably in those follow-up surveys around the state of the sector's leadership pipeline that could perhaps flesh out that slide around the difference in racial and ethnic diversity of different types of positions within organizations.
You know, it's interesting that we saw some regional differences seemingly in terms of the kind of availability, the perceived availability of a pipeline. What we were hearing across regions was that there's a dearth. I hesitate to use the word dearth, but that there's a dearth of people available, even post-pandemic, when people are sort of looking more toward national recruiting, right? You know, people can work remotely now in many instances, and so a lot of the nonprofit leaders talked about broadening their search beyond the Commonwealth of Virginia. Even so, we repeatedly heard that there were, particularly in development, unfilled positions that had been unfilled for a really long period of time. I think it's worth saying that if there's already more diversity of a certain kind in program lead positions, that it is worth then investing in those folks to be able to take on positions in other parts of the organization. So just because you're a program lead doesn't mean you can't go into finance. And so kind of broadening the perspective of what the qualifications are or the requirements are to fill a particular role, and understanding the ways in which people's experience can in fact qualify them to do something different in an organization, I think can help fill some of those roles as well.
Thanks. And in some sense, that ties to the earlier statistic around organizations, particularly organizations with more infrastructure, seeking support for leadership development for junior and mid-level staff, perhaps seeing the opportunities to grow and develop leaders within the organization, and very much wanting to do that, understanding that many nonprofits are small businesses, and sometimes folks within the organization are limited in terms of their professional development trajectories.
Absolutely.
Great. I think that gets us up to date on questions for now. So why don't we shift forward into the next part of the presentation?
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. So the fourth key finding is around collaboration and convening. Here we saw that nonprofits seek enhanced or new relationships with foundations and government agencies, and the opportunity to connect with and learn from each other. Really interesting here, we saw that almost all of the nonprofits are in collaborations, and most want more. Nonprofits appear to be highly collaborative, with 78% actively providing joint programs and 78% sharing information. In terms of sought after collaborations, joint ventures where organizations are essentially investing together to accomplish a specific goal or project was highest with 66%. Followed by joint programs where organizations are part of a partnership that's oriented around a certain outcome. Areas with the least likelihood for collaboration include sharing administrative functions and mergers. A lot to unpack there, though. Building awareness is an area of high need amongst these nonprofits. More than 75% cited that the urgent need to build mission, program, and service awareness over the next year. And among larger nonprofits, there tended to be a desire for capacity building support to do two things. One is to make other nonprofits and funders aware of the organization's presence and its mission, so there's less likelihood for overlap and more likelihood for support, but also to facilitate advocacy and potential collaboration. So we saw this in terms of organizations who, for instance, were moving into new geographies. How do they build relationships there, both with funders as well as potential nonprofit allies or partners, and finding finding ways for capacity builders and those who are really sort of on the ground to be able to facilitate that relationship building was something that we heard repeatedly. So in essence, nonprofits are working together and they are looking for more opportunities. When asked about new collaborations, 60% of respondents expressed interest in advocating together as a specific area. So they told us that we need more advocates. So it's good for nonprofits to be aware of us, of who's out there, but many nonprofits have gone by the wayside. And so how do we make sure that nonprofits are both aware of what's happening within the their ecosystems, but also aware of who's doing what, so there are opportunities for collaboration or working on issues together. And then we also heard that people are struggling with building relationships with government. This is extremely difficult with identifying those sources, and it's tedious work to understand what they're asking for. We see this as potentially an opportunity where, as we look at the action that can be done here to expand opportunities for nonprofits and funders and governments to connect and partner purposefully, there's an opportunity to provide meaningful grant dollars to fund collaboration, systems change work, continuous learning, risk-taking, and innovation among funders. But there are also opportunities for governments to be able to work on simplifying the path to engaging with them. I'll turn it over to Paitra here to take on the next section, which is the last of the key findings. You're muted, Paitra.
I did it too. Thank you. So last but not least, evaluation. This is also an area of urgent need for support by most nonprofits. A large majority of them expressed a need for evaluation support. So we thought we would show you a little bit of information about this. What we found is that nonprofits really want to do this. They want to be involved in evaluation, and they are doing it to the extent that they can. 78% of them, the survey respondents said they're evaluating the impact of their work, but they have, really limited capacity to do this. So they're really relying on output data to measure their impact. And so, about half of them, a little over half of them talked about looking at participation, enrollment, those sorts of items as evidence of impact. When we asked them about how they're tracking their impact, a lot of them cited calculations that they're doing, right? Like they're looking at the number of sales, again, enrollment, volunteer hours, and that sort of thing. And what this says to us is that if we as a sector want deeper understanding of the impact of the work that these organizations are doing, it really has to be a whole sector commitment, because the capacity for nonprofits on their own to take this on is limited. The next slide, you'll see that, a lot, 80% of the survey respondents said that this was an urgent need. You see there that only 13% feel like evaluation is already a strength. I think that if we're thinking about evaluation from an equity standpoint, a key understanding is that there's no one-size-fits-all evaluation strategy. And so perhaps the evaluation requirements for smaller organizations are different for those that have the staff capacity for more sophisticated tracking and measuring, maybe. Staff capacity issues are they're ubiquitous, right? It impacts everything that the nonprofits are trying to do. And in terms of sort of the differing ways in which evaluation, the differing needs that nonprofits have in terms of evaluation support. On the next slide, we have, 3 different quotes about evaluation that we thought were, good evidence of some of the differences that nonprofits have in terms of need. So that first quote is really suggesting a need for longitudinal evaluation, right? They need time. So this was a person who was saying the bigger beast is outcome tracking, long-term as well as short-term. What happens long-term with the business and even what happens to the owner. So for the work that they're doing, what's most appropriate is the long view in terms of evaluating impact. In that situation, a quarterly impact report to a funder is probably not terribly useful to the funder or to the organization. A little bit differently, that second quote in the middle is saying that, we only have anecdotal evidence of the impact that we're generating. It's hard to measure. We don't have clear-cut metrics. So that's an organization that probably needs support in terms of developing and implementing larger scale, maybe surveys, right? Evaluation than what they're currently able to do. And then the third quote on the end is suggesting that while it would be nice to get input on evaluation strategy, the real issue for them is having the resources to implement that strategy. So again, it's not surprising that organizations are saying they need support for evaluation. We think the key point here, though, is in recognizing that what's needed can be different for different organizations. And so in terms of recommendations, we think that it would be really important to target evaluation resources that really meet organizations where they are. And we think that that's what will facilitate learning and growth and impact, frankly, because that's what enables organizations to make adjustments to increase the impact of what they're doing. The example action that we pulled for this one is actually for government. So, an example action, really, if you're in a government funding position, we're suggesting that you collaborate with nonprofits to design processes for government contracts and state grant funds that are a bit more equitable in terms of evaluating their impact. Those are particularly difficult areas for smaller organizations. We heard repeatedly about the difficulty in navigating kind of government reporting requirements. We think that that's an issue for organizations with regard to other types of funding as well, but it is particularly clear with government funding. I think that's all we have for that one. We can maybe see if any more questions have come in.
Thanks, Paitra. And I'm curious, with your research background and expertise, there's also often in the context of evaluation, this conversation around, should in evaluation we be so focused on data-driven metrics as opposed to, or with more emphasis and attention to anecdotal or qualitative measures of impact or success. And I'm curious what your perspective is on that, given the feedback that we were getting through the survey.
Yeah, so I, of course, am biased because I'm a qualitative researcher and feel that there's somewhat of a misleading sort of sense that if something, that numerical data is more reliable and that, or frankly, more true than qualitative data. So I believe we had one participant who talked about internal considerations about how they thought they should be asking for evaluation from their grantees, and moving more toward a qualitative understanding of impact, because certainly if you're only measuring impact quantitatively, statistically, then an organization that is having really deep impact, but with a smaller number of people, may appear not to be very effective or very impactful because they're just not reaching as many people. We do work across a variety of industries and are very busy because a lot of large organizations that have the capacity to get any sort of statistical understanding that they want find that it's insufficient for understanding the why. and the how. And so you can't do more of something if you don't know why it's working or why it's not working. And so from my perspective, qualitative insight, what is, and I hesitate to use the word anecdotal, that which is supposedly anecdotal, I think provides all of the insight that we need to know what the impact of organizations is, because it's not the pure numbers just don't tell you enough of what's going on. But again, I'm biased.
Understanding the perspective that you bring, appreciate you sharing that perspective. I want to toggle back to the slides around collaboration, and wondering if you all can recall in any of your qualitative conversations, if there were differences in working with government entities versus community funders, and are there any specific barriers for working with government entities that we can speak to from those conversations, or is it just generally harder to navigate?
I'm reflecting. I do recall, aside from the concerns about reporting, there was also sort of in terms of navigating government funding, there seemed to be more of an issue of understanding what governments are what do they want? What are they looking for? That seemed to be really unclear for nonprofits, and I don't know if this is true or not, but it seemed that at least with community funding, community funders, there was more clarity around what their priorities are, right? Their funding priorities. That did not seem to be true in terms of sort of understanding government funding, like not really being clear on what their priorities are. And then in addition, I think there was a stronger sense that that government funders kind of have their tried and true organizations, and that's who they will continue to fund. If you're a newbie, if you don't have a track record, and part of this is driven by governments needing to answer to citizens, right? So you want to be able to say in your town hall, right, this organization has a track record, they've done X, Y, and Z already. But that means that if you're new and perfectly capable of doing the work, you may not ever have an opportunity to demonstrate that. So those are the two things that I remember offhand.
Thanks. That's great. There was another question around when we were collecting the data via the survey or follow-up conversations. Were there questions about what scope organizations were looking for creating impact statistics? And were organizations looking to show impact across a community or a region or the state? My guess is it was mixed because the data set was mixed, but curious what your feedback is on that.
Yeah, people were, it was really kind of the assumption was they're talking about the scope of the people they serve, right? So it might be at the community level, neighborhood level, because that is who we serve. If I'm a statewide organization, great, yes, let's demonstrate impact in a much broader sense. So there wasn't sort of one kind of level of evaluation that people were talking about. To your point, Christine, it was a mixed sample.
depending on their mission and the scope of the program
Right.
and reach, right?
Right.
And then another question was around I think it would likely be in the qualitative conversations. Was there any discussion or feedback that you got from those interviewed, or that we got data from, around what were some of the top benefits that help nonprofits attract and retain staff? I know that wasn't one of the questions we asked, but curious if that came up at all in the discussion.
Not systematically. There were a couple of comments about the importance of things like healthcare and professional development. So the opportunity to grow as a nonprofit staff member, right? In the same way that you might get support if you were working in a corporate environment for continuing your education, going to conferences, all of those sort of professional development opportunities. That did come up, even though just sort of in people's comments, even though we didn't ask specifically about what benefits were most helpful.
And
honestly, I can't believe wage.
Right.
Right. Yeah, not feeling like you have to sacrifice your family's economic security in order to do the work.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. And I know there's some information about that at the national level, so we can follow up in our follow-up email to this town hall. We can include some resources for that to the town hall participant who asked that question. And then just a last question with respect to nonprofit collaborations. Did the study uncover any initiatives that we're using, and we'll put it in quotes, a collective impact approach? In terms of the collaboration and the types of collaboration in order to address a system that needed to be changed, or a structure that needed to be modernized, for example.
No. So part of what the collaboration conversation was about, really, well, I should say what the collaboration conversation was about really was more about sort of, were they engaging in collaboration with whom, and sort of how that was going. And so we weren't probing on a specific approaches, and collective impact approach did not figure in any of the conversations that we had.
And can you remind folks who who took the survey, and who did we interview? There was a question whether or not it was primarily leadership or other positions within the organization that took the survey.
That was a mix, Joeffrey. I see you nodding your head. You might have that.
It was primarily leadership. I don't have the exact numbers, but I would say probably around 70% were either executive leader or board chair. In the interviews, though, we focused on executive leadership because we thought had the broadest view of the organization.
And then a follow-up question: how did we decide what type of organizations to invite to participate in the survey, really, which is what led to the pool for the follow-up interviews?
We had oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Paitra.
I was just going to say that we have an algorithm that we use that takes a snapshot of our entire pool and lets us know what a representative sample of that pool would look like. So we used that first to make sure that we kind of had a baseline sense of organizations, how many organizations of a given size in a given region, et cetera, that we were targeting for interviews. That said, we also wanted to be sure that the interviews included nonprofit leaders of a variety of types. And so we did oversample to make sure that we had people of color represented among the interviewees. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, we may have augmented the interviewee pool with regard to region as well. I would have to, I'm sorry, I have to look back to see what we did about that, but we wanted to make sure that every region was represented as well.
That sounds right. Understood. And then just a final question. Was there any comparison between nonprofit organizations and other comparable companies or businesses in the sector? For example, if staff recruitment is hard across the board in education, is it any harder in education-focused nonprofits, or is it the same?
We did not dig into that because we were really focused on the content of the survey and sort of diving deeper into that rather than looking more broadly. Again, one of the things that we're seeing from this study is that I think there are many opportunities to dive deeper into certain areas to try to understand what the dynamics are there and what may be the levers that can be pulled. But a consistent thing we were hearing from the leaders that we interviewed is that this question of competing for staff, really now it's not a regional or local competition, it's a national competition and everyone's in the same boat.
Great, thank you. Well, we're about to wrap up here, but I wanted to ask the two of you if you had one top line takeaway or one thing that you hoped that the audience here today would take with them and continue to think about, what might that be? And I would encourage those in the audience too, if you have one highlight from today, you can go ahead and put it in the chat as well, so we start to see what bubbled up in the review of this data today. So Joeffrey, why don't we start with you?
So for me, it's around collaboration. And one of the early conversations we had with a government official, and this is sort of a peripheral way to look at collaboration, but they were talking about how important it is for the organizations that they are trying to serve through legislation to be in partnership with them so they can understand how the issues are shaped, what matters to them, and design that legislation in a way that even from a funding perspective, it's likely to be successful as a piece of legislation. And so to me, that's a point of collaboration with an elected official, right? But there are other types of collaboration that are available. And I think being very intentional about those that you seek out would be the point that I would really drive home.
How about you, Paitra?
I really am taken by some comments that we heard about sort of the need to elevate the visibility of the sector as a whole. That there is very little knowledge, even among current college students, for example, about the nonprofit sector as a career path. And so I think that sort of given the level of concern with the pipeline, and we've heard all about the Great Resignation and those sorts of things that are impacting organizations across the board. And given that the leadership skews older, right? Even when we look at the age ranges of leaders and nonprofit staff members, skews older. There's got to be some attention to promoting the sector among younger people. And I think that might require thinking about it a little differently, engaging younger people in ways to understand what would make the nonprofit sector more attractive to them, how it might be more impactful from their perspective. I think it's critical. So that's kind of it's not an overarching key takeaway, but that's the thing that I keep thinking about.
Thank you both again, and to our town hall participants for showing up today and really helping us dig into the sector data. To help you explore this data further, we've created a discussion guide and we will drop a link to that guide in the chat.